of that. Then later on in the show, my wife Hope is going to be joining us for a brief discussion about some things that we have going on at the INLP Center that are very exciting. So thanks so much for joining us here on Natural News Radio. We'll be with Dr. Breggin here in just a few moments. All right, my guest, Dr. Peter Breggin of Breggin.com. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Breggin. Great to have you back.
Mike, I'm really delighted to be talking with you again, and to be also, on the website that you publish on with Michael Adams. I'm delighted to have that somewhat direct affiliation with you now.
Yes, absolutely. I was thrilled to see your articles on naturalnews.com, and as expected, they're striking a nerve. They're popular with Natural News readers, so that's wonderful. Now, I'm excited to do the show with you today because we're talking about some inherent flaws in psychiatry. You being a reformed psychiatrist, I would call you an enlightened psychiatrist, going back many years, and I'm excited to do the show on these on psychiatry's inherent flaw and how you believe that, I don't know if I'm using too strong a word here, it's set up for failure, or that ultimately it won't succeed or provide the solutions that people are looking for. I think it's just an appropriate topic. So what do you got for us on this?
Well, if we look back at the history of psychiatry, its origins go back to the state mental hospital system. The state mental hospitals developed in Western Europe and then in the United States as the Industrial Revolution moved in. So in our country, before the Civil War, there were practically no state mental hospitals. After the Civil War, you get the Industrial Revolution really heats up in the U.S., and urbanization heats up, and you get, outside of all the big cities, a repository for the people who can't make it in the cities, for the urban poor, for the chronically ill, for the aged, for children who have no homes, and for people who are obviously demented by brain diseases or have what we call psychiatric problems, psychological problems, and have delusions or hallucinations. But the main characteristic of all the people in these so-called hospitals throughout the West was poverty. Poverty and the lack of affiliation with anyone to take care of them. In the beginning, they're actually combined with the poorhouses, but as the poorhouses went out of vogue and were no longer accepted in the West, basically the poorhouse became the state mental hospital. Out of the state mental hospital system comes organized psychiatry. That's its roots. So if you look at the American Journal of Psychiatry, it was originally the journal of the hospital superintendents in America. And so from the beginning, it's all about medical doc put in a position of being able to civilly commit, that is to lock up people, bypassing the criminal justice system to enable the easier putting away of people for whom there was no seeming place in the society. That's really what it comes down to. So from the beginning, we have doctors doing a job they shouldn't have been doing. That was, in the U.S., should have been unconstitutional, and justifying that job. And how are they going to justify it? Well, from the very beginning, they determined that, of course, since they were doctors, these people were not inmates, they were patients, literally. And as patients, they must have physical diseases and genetic disorders, because, after all, we're doctors, medical doctors, treating them. In fact, we're only just becoming psychiatrists through this whole system of the state mental hospitals. And we knew at the beginning that this was not a good approach, because simultaneously there were small havens run by Quakers often. There was a very famous institute in Great Britain run by the Tuke family. And if you go back and you read the Tukes writing about their hospital system back in the 19th century, they're talking about basically don't trust the medical doctors. We have better approaches to helping our fellow Quakers, kindness, caring. We have to teach the attendants to be thoughtful and compassionate. We use moral persuasion, good food, exercise, and lots of relationship, which is the key to helping people, who especially very disturbed people. So they nailed it perfectly in these old books. It's so interesting to read. But along comes psychiatry, rejects this very successful system, which begins to evolve around the same period of time and a little earlier, and imposes the medical model and the medical approach and the involuntary treatment of patients.
Let me ask you, did psychiatry knowingly reject this, or was this a just a matter of tunnel vision, where they said, we're doctors, we're going to do what we're going to do? I mean, it sounds sinister to me, and I'm wondering if it is, or whether it's just ignorance in sort of lacking on the medical profession's part, lacking any other perspective on what might be helpful to these people.
I'm going to answer it obliquely by telling you the story of a friend of mine, though I haven't seen him in a long, long time, who did his dissertation in Norway on Nazi concentration camp in Norway.
Okay.
The Norwegians during World War II prided themselves in being a people so unlike the Nazis that they would never indulge in the kinds of brutality that the Nazis did. And, you know, I think they were very quickly overrun and taken over by the Nazis. Well, as the war went on, the Nazis tried to farm out some of their concentration camps, and they created one in Norway. And as my friend discovered in his dissertation and looking at what happened, that Norwegians behaved just like Germans when given the opportunity. So human nature, I would say, is such that if you present people the opportunity for unlimited power over other human beings, most people, certainly many people, in the case of psychiatry, a whole profession, will take advantage of it. So I think it's about human nature. It's about social structures. It's about how we have to. It's why we have a Bill of Rights and a Constitution. It's about protecting against things like psychiatry, which have bypassed the Constitution by this quirk of, well, this is civil commitment, not criminal. There's nothing in the Constitution about it in particular.
It's for your own good. Because you have a disease and I have a diagnosis, and therefore I'm going to lock you up.
That's right. And because you get worse and worse while you're being locked up, brutalized, raped, having your brain damaged, and so on and so forth, we're going to discover that you have chronic mental illnesses.
Right.
Because nobody gets out of these places when they're put in them initially.
The longer you're in there, the more we're justified in doing what we're doing. Obviously, look at the evidence. Of course, the lockup is part of the problem, but it's providing evidence.
It is the problem. The lockup is the problem. That's right. Now, two things I want to address. One is what I think is the only revolution that occurred in psychiatry and the one we're still in, and it's an old revolution. Up until the 1930s, as these places, these institutional lockups grew in size, they became feudal systems. You know, they fed themselves, you know, from their own farms. When they'd get a cook would be hospitalized, they'd never let him go. He'd become the cook. The tailor would get hospitalized, he'd become the tailor, and so on and on. They really developed whole communities that were self-sufficient. And they became huger and huger because there was no restraint on the power to lock people up. And society in industrial revolutionary times in particular was just filled with opportunity to lock people up. Although, frankly, it just continued and continued and continued into the 50s because of just the acquisition of power over people. And then the big problem was, how do you control these huge mobs, 10,000, 20,000 people locked up in these facilities like Pilgrim State? Well, they beat them, they dunked them in water, they bled them, they put leeches on them, they froze them, they had all
froze them.
Oh yeah, put them in cold water baths.
Mm.
They poisoned them. They gave them arsenic and other poisons. They did everything they could to control this population. It didn't work very well. Then in the 1930s, psychiatry discovered that if you damage the brain, that produces docility. That produces docility. And it starts out with these horrendous shock treatments, insulin coma, where people are overdosed with insulin till they're dying, literally dying and comatose, writhing on the floor, to be brought back then by force feeding of sugar, orange juice or water. Metrazole shock, where you give a person an overdose of an extreme stimulant so that while they're standing there or sitting there, they feel themselves being driven into insanity, which is culminates in a convulsion, and again they're on the floor and convulsing. Then shock treatment, which looked neater and more modern, taking literally voltage out of the wall and blasting it through a person's brain until knocking them into a convulsion. And during the same period of time, a few years before electroshock, you get lobotomy, for which Muniz, M-O-N-I-Z, the Portuguese, got the Nobel Prize when challenged on the hazards of lobotomy. I had a quote from him in one of my early books. He said, there are plenty of Portuguese. So you have this awakening of psychiatry into what it felt was modern science, because it was behaving like neurosurgeons, like doctors, going specifically after the brain. That was the revolution in psychiatry, because you could make people docile by giving them hundreds of shock treatments. Some of these patients got hundreds, by giving them insulin coma, by giving them lobotomies.
How about the ice pick lobotomy, right?
Well, yes, that was Walter Freeman. I was the first and only medical expert daring enough to finally go up against Walter Freeman in court in the early 70s, and he died during the process, so we never got to drag him into court. He would go around doing shows at state hospitals. Sometimes with a flourish, he'd have a pick in both hands and tap it on, around the eyeball and through the skull behind the eyeball where the skull is thin, and swish it around with both hands. I'm not exaggerating here. He was noted not to even bother cleaning off the picks between these brutal assaults.
Yeah, that's sociopathic behavior. I mean, right? I mean, he should have been. I wrote an article about him for Natural News. I called it "Take a Ride on the Lobotomobile," because he would go around in his van or his RV, right? And it was called the Lobotomobile. You know better than I do. I mean, you took this guy on, but my goodness, that is, if your average person went around stabbing people in the eye and scrambling their brains with an ice pick, they'd end up in jail. This guy never had anything. He didn't even get a slap on the wrist. He celebrated.
Well, he did it in front of amphitheaters of physicians and psychiatrists. It wasn't secret. It wasn't secret at all. He was president of the D.C. Medical Association and so on. Again, we're speaking about, this is psychiatry, and of course, and I'll only talk about this briefly. This is described a lot in the book, The Conscience of Psychiatry, which is about my reform work. In the 70s, I took several years out of my life to stop the return of lobotomy and psychosurgeries, and including on children. We're doing them on little black children in Mississippi. Little, like 5 years old, and in the 70s. And it's because of that work that I became the first psychiatrist to stand up in public against lobotomy, the first psychiatrist to go into a courtroom as an expert and to win a case of lobotomy. I'm the first psychiatrist to go into court and win a shock case. So why am I the first? Because this whole profession has rallied around and has this horrible tradition of using brain disability as a treatment and making up these false diagnoses to justify it. It's embedded in the history, and it's still there. It hasn't changed. Shock treatment continues. Virtually any city of any size in this country is going to have a shock machines. A city like Syracuse, which is pretty small here, upstate New York, there's at least 3 places or so that you can get electroshock within driving distance. New York City is going to have several places. So we're talking about a history. Now I want to branch off into another aspect of this history, which is especially telling. In 1920 in Germany, a psychiatrist and a lawyer wrote a book about the murder of mental patients, the destruction of what they called the destruction of life not worth living. And they proposed that that incurable mentally ill people be destroyed at any age. The book, by the way, I went to Germany and I gave a lecture on this. I studied this a lot. Gave a lecture on it at the first ever conference in West Germany at the time. There was still a Berlin Wall in West Germany about psychiatry in the Third Reich. And I went with my friend Jeffrey Mason, Masson, who spoke German, read German, and we interviewed people there. And we were going to write a book that we never got to do. But I did write an article that's published about the psychiatry in Nazi Germany, which you can find on my website. It came out of that talk. Well, so here Hitler has no power at all. I think that's about the time of his just beginning to, become a small time thug politician. 1920.
Okay.
This is already being written about. By the time Hitler comes to power, psychiatry is ready to organize itself for the mass extermination of its own patients. Without any signature from Hitler, psychiatry does this on a mass level, sets up the first extermination centers, the first use of fake showers and soap, the first use of gas. In this case, I believe they were using diesel engines. They didn't get to the fancier stuff yet. And they justify it as a medical procedure for euthanasia. And so closely involved were they with what became the Holocaust that the first Jews killed in the concentration camps, at first they weren't extermination camps, they were concentration camps, the first exterminations, the formal, I'm not talking about some Nazi shooting somebody, I'm talking about the formal exterminations were done on the psychiatric euthanasia forms. The first commandant of an extermination center was a man named Stengel, who was the former head of a euthanasia or medical murder center. And the initial equipment for some of the big Polish extermination centers came from the murder program. Hitler stopped the formal murder program because it was the only thing he ever met public protest over, and he stopped it. Psychiatry continued it on its own, so that at war's end, I have one lengthy report from a man that made contact with me, telling me the story and sent me photos, that a mental hospital called Kaufbeuren was still exterminating its patients after the war was over in his sector. And they had ovens to cremate them in. So virtually every major observer, all the major observers at Nuremberg, after hearing all the evidence, declared that the Holocaust, and listen to this because this sounds impossible, that the Holocaust might never have taken place without the medical murder program, because it showed you could systematically murder people and carry it out in a bureaucratic, methodical manner, and that you could do it without too much rebellion from within the society, and the medical profession would go entirely along with it in the beginning, and ultimately never rebelled against any of the murder programs, the medical profession. Now, these comments that I'm paraphrasing were made by 2 Germans from the equivalent of the German AMA. These similar comments were made by Andrew Ivy, who was our AMA expert at the trials, and also by a very Nazi-like character who was an American psychiatrist who was our military head at the tribunals. He was a psychiatrist and a military head. So psychiatry lent itself very readily and was a leader in the creation of the Holocaust. Then if you look at Russia and Cuba, you'll find that, I don't know about Cuba right now, but I just don't know, but years ago, and in the USSR, when you had a political dissident who couldn't be controlled in any other way other than killing them, you sent them to psycho prisons where these people, and they report this, were stripped of all dignity and all ability to rebel by, guess what? Injections of antipsychotic drugs in the clinical range. That did them in. That stopped them from political protest. So psychiatry is embedded in the psychiatric history. It's embedded in the psychiatric notion that when we harm the brain, we're doing good. And all psychiatric drugs harm the brain. All psychoactive substances harm the brain, whether it's marijuana, offend some listeners with that, but you can't smoke marijuana indefinitely without changing your brain and slowing it down and having your faculties slow down. Some people get psychotic on marijuana, end up in mental hospitals. It's a dangerous drug. Alcohol, horrible damage inflicted by alcohol, another psychoactive substance. Any drug that's going to really calm you down or otherwise affect your emotions is not good for your brain. Well, the psychiatric drugs are among the worst. We're now finding that the roles of disability of children and adults, disability roles in the U.S. are being swelled by the effects of exposure to psychiatric drugs over months and years. So the system of psychiatry doesn't have anything to do with psychotherapy. There's nothing to do with, getting your master's degree in therapy or your PhD in a therapy field. It is a medical subspecialty rooted in the state mental hospitals with a long tradition of damaging the brain, often touted as such. Before I came along and started quoting them in 1979, my first medical book, was called Electroshock, Its Brain Disabling Effects, 1979. And I quote all of these guys saying, hey, we're damaging the brain. That's good for the patient. They need less brains. They need less intelligence. They need less feeling. Lobotomy, yeah, we're flattening feelings. We're taking away, we're making people indifferent toward life. They're better off that way. They're suffering. So I just quoted all of this in my first books. Now they don't talk that way anymore because of that, because, I've been quoting them so much. It's so devastating.
You've held up a mirror to the profession. I got to tell you, I'm absolutely speechless at some of the information that you're giving out here in terms of the history of psychiatry. And
on Natural News Radio.
Let me tell people some good sources of this history. On my website, you want to see a younger, more angry Peter Bregan from the 1990s. I give a talk in Harlem to a Harlem audience about the psychiatric Holocaust. It's in the context of also talking about a program that my wife and I stopped, where the federal government in the 1990s wanted to go into the inner cities, find genetic and biochemical abnormalities in inner city children and treat them in advance with drugs because they were going to be violent when they grew up. It was a U.S. version of eugenics, and we stopped that program. And we wrote a book about it called oh my gosh, I'm blocking on the name of it. The War Against Children of Color. There's a chapter in there on the Holocaust. You can also, as I started to say, see a video of me on my website under my video archives giving a lengthy talk with far more detail than this. And then also noodle around on my website and go to the social issues section, or just noodle Nazi Germany and medical murder, you'll find an article that I wrote with tons of citations that was published in the International Journal of Risk and Safety in Medicine in Europe, and it's basically the lecture I gave in Germany. So there's some really good hard data on this that people can look at.
This is at Breggin.com.
Yep, BREGGIN.com.
Okay. Now, tell me about the future. Do you think change is coming? Do you think reform is coming? I mean, you've been working your whole life on this. You've taken on pharmaceutical companies. You've taken down some people. You've put a stop to some programs. But talk to me about the future, just for in the last few minutes we have here.
Well, I'm hoping it's going to be like the Berlin Wall, where the system finally can't maintain itself anymore and collapses. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the public now is far more aware of the dangers of psychiatric treatment. Just a couple of days ago, I got a letter from a pediatrician who's changing his whole practice around. Read one of my books, and it confirmed things he'd been worried about for years. And he's actually sending a letter to his patients that he's not going to be giving stimulants in the future. You know, they have a few months to find another doctor, but he wants to offer educational and therapeutic alternatives to these kids. So there's changes coming around psychiatry, in the medical profession, in social work and psychology. When I go now and talk, and I'm being invited more and more than ever to speak, I'm on the radio more and more, and so on. My blogs are very, among the most widely read on whatever blog site they appear, including Huffington Post. And so there's real changes going on everywhere I go and in the environment. But psychiatry has no alternative to this model because they've gone to medical school. They've gone through psychiatric training. They haven't learned anything about talking to people. They haven't learned anything about empathy or care or love or support systems or family life. So they're stuck with their model, and they've got the full force of the most powerful industry in the world. Probably, it may be the most powerful industry in terms of its PR abilities, certainly, and that's the pharmaceutical industry. So I think the only way it's going to ultimately change is by what you and I and a lot of other people are now doing, and so that people finally say, I'm just not going and I'm not taking my kids. I'm going to find another way to gain help. I'll turn to therapy. I'll turn to religion. I'll turn to child guidance books. I'll take parenting courses. I will go another way, but I won't go that way. And as that happens, psychiatry is going to lose some of its power, but it isn't going to really lose much of it without someday some group taking on this whole issue of the constitutionality of locking up people, the evilness of damaging brains as an attempt to help people and so on. So it's positive in a lot of ways, but psychiatry is not on its own going to reverse itself because there's no place to go.
Right, and the field would just implode. I mean, I often say in my articles on Natural News, I mean, there's no one less qualified to help you with a psychological problem than a psychiatrist because they don't study communication, they don't study family dynamics, they don't study even how the subjective mind works. They just don't have that set of skills. And so if you've got a problem that's rooted in your psyche, a psychiatrist is not the person to go to for help because they simply don't have the training or the education. And much less.
One of the things I'm trying to tell social workers, Mike, and psychologists and counselors is that they know so much more than psychiatrists. It's time to empower yourself and not listen to them.
Listen, an average mom knows more than a psychiatrist about how to help someone because it begins with compassion. It begins with, can you put yourself in somebody else's shoes and help them figure out what's going on and offer solutions? Can you love them? It's those kinds of things, and those are just the fundamentals. That's the starting point.
Absolutely.
And are psychiatrists trained in that? No. No, they're not. They're, of course not.
Well, it's a marvel to read your writings over the years. I mean, you're right on. Let me give 2 plugs for myself. One, I have a new book out called Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, a guide for prescribers, therapists, patients, and families. It's about a team approach to coming off psych drugs. The first half of it is about the dangers of the drugs, a real good summary, and the second half is about how to come off psychiatric drug withdrawal. You can get it on my website, you can get it on Amazon, and so on. And the second thing is I have a big conference coming up.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah, I spoke to you about it last year.
You ought to come.
I should come.
In the future we could, our speakers are filled, but in the future you'd be a great speaker at one of our conferences.
Wow.
The conference is April 26th through 28th. We keep the price down low. We really want people to come. We don't make money on this. Ginger and I end up contributing, not taking from this. It's the Empathic Therapy Conference, April 26th through 28th in in Syracuse, New York.
Okay.
In Syracuse, New York. And you can get to it from my website, Bregan.com, or directly empathictherapy.org. Empathictherapy.org. It's open to the public. It's going to have so many different things going on. Myself and Bert Karen, who is a grand master of therapy, we're going to do a 3-hour master workshop on therapy. But it's really about life, and anybody can enjoy it, anybody who's interested in people. But that's one of the things we're going to do. We're going to have certainly one of the most powerful lawyers doing class action suits around psychiatric drugs is going to do a presentation. So we're going to go both on the attack end and we're going to go on the positive end. Howie Glasser, who is just a charming, marvelous therapist, is going to do an evening of a film and how to do his nurtured heart therapy. I'll be talking, but it's not going to be mostly me. I'll talk some every day, I guess, but this is really a conference of a number, really 25 or so really top people coming to talk. And it's open to the public. We might very well fill up. We almost did last year. We're set for just a little over 200 people. It's an intimate, loving, caring, empowering setting. So empathictherapy.org, April 26th through 28th, coming up.
And I hope there are psychiatrists, if there are any psychiatrists within the sound of our voice here, go to empathictherapy.org and attend the conference. If you have a psychiatrist and you're listening to this program, send a link to your psychiatrist. I mean, one of the things to do, what we hope is that people will, that patients, or maybe patients or prisoners, right? But that, that the people will start to empower themselves and disempower psychiatrists who practice in a traditional way that's rooted in this history. But we also hope that psychiatrists will start to reform, do we not? And educate themselves on how to really help people. Because think about it, given the natural power that people give to the medical profession, what if there were more psychiatrists like you, Dr. Bregan, who started to actually help people with real skills and tools and offering things with real therapeutic value? Wouldn't that be a revolution?
That would be a revolution, but I think it's mostly going to come from the outside. If you look at our advisory council for empathic therapy, there's a large number of psychiatrists there, but they've really chosen a unique lifestyle to believe in the things that we believe in together. And most of them don't want to go out front and take the abuse that goes along with that, but they're really wonderful in supporting us and our organization.
All right, Dr. Peter Bregan, great to have you back on the show, and thanks so much for contributing the information that you contribute. It's a great value, it's a great education, and we'll look forward to having you back on the show again.
Thank you for your good work, Mike.
All right, John Rappaport joins us again, the NoMoreFakeNews.com segment of Mental Health Exposed. Welcome back, John.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Now we're talking about psychiatry and the sordid history of psychiatry. It's really scary stuff. But I understand that you've got something on the brain mapping project.
Yeah, it's even more scary, if anything could be, and it ties right into psychiatry and neurology. Because what's happened here is that in the wake of the Sandy Hook murders, Obama is, talking about expanding greatly mental health services across the country, community services, which of course means more psychiatric diagnoses, more of these drugs, more violence, more killing, etc., because drugs do that to people. But B, he has announced a 10-year, heavily funded, at least $1 billion, it'll be more, project, kind of like a Manhattan Project of the brain, to map all the activity of the brain. The brain activity mapping, BAM, B-A-M. And this will involve federal agencies, National Institute of Mental Health, which is psychiatric in essence, universities, foundations, pharmaceutical companies, what have you. Any place inside the medical cartel where there are psychiatrists and neurologists, you're going to have these people looking for grant money and getting grant money to contribute to this project of mapping everything that goes on in the brain. We're talking about to the level of the neuron.
Is this how is this a bad thing? I mean, it seems like a good thing on the surface, right? I mean, don't we want to know
on the surface
more about the human brain and what goes on and how it functions? I mean,
exactly.
Why would anyone ever question the motive of a project like this? I mean,
because, yes, on the surface it'll all be about, look, we might find a cure for Alzheimer's, et cetera, autism, blah, 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 blah. It's all about healing and curing and everything. But from the discussion that you had here about psychiatry and its sordid history, we know now that it really is all about control. That's really what it's about. It's about squeezing people's lives into narrow parameters, drugging them, and putting them under the control of an overweening set of masters in the society. And the Brain Map Project will inevitably be turned into that as well. For example, we have DARPA, which is the technological wing of the Pentagon, innovations in military ways to kill people, et cetera, they are going to be heavily involved in the brain mapping project. And one might say, well, what the hell are they doing involved?
The military.
How do we know what they're doing involved?
Jeez.
The essence of this is going to be, how can we control the activity of the brain so that we can, quote, eliminate the bad things that the brain does to people and just be left with the good things. And if you want somebody to make that decision for you at the level of the neurons in your brain and be able to actually enforce it, not only scientifically but legally, then you definitely qualify for being crazy right off the bat.
So the bad things that we want to eliminate, well, maybe that is political dissidents, outspoken people who believe in free speech, people who like to shoot guns, right?
Sure.
I mean,
people who rebel generally, people who are independent-minded in general, because it's very easy to make these things show up on brain scans. I mean, they've already done that. So to take it down to the level of the neuron, what we're talking about here are value judgments all the way along the line. Well, look at this kind of activity. As we see here on the chart here, we can see it in real time in so-and-so's brain. This would certainly qualify as abnormal activity, and it is related to a deeply held core of resistance to what society needs and wants.
And so
we have to find a way to eliminate that.
So the way to eliminate it is through pharmaceutical intervention, right? I mean, I can only imagine that this brain mapping project is going to be put to use to develop more precise pharmaceuticals to deliver more predictable medical outcomes, right?
Absolutely, but not only that, because let's look up the road a decade from now. A decade is a long time in terms of technology. And this is not going to stop after 10 years. I mean, these people are not going to just say, okay, well, that's the end of that and walk away. They're going to say, we've made great strides and we have to continue this. So what we're looking at here is an organ of the body that is intensely electrical, electromagnetic. And so there will be developed, you can count on it, all sorts of electromagnetic strategies to affect the activity of the brain, to channel it into this rather than that, to dampen it down, to make it more pacified, which won't even necessarily involve chemicals at all. It will involve electromagnetic radiation. It will involve broadcasting, so to speak, certain frequencies. I mean, there's already a wealth of information about this in the literature, experiments that have been done, patents that have been taken out, and so forth. But this is going to take all that to a new level entirely.
And I understand the real futurists are talking about little nano robots, biological robots to inject into the bloodstream that go throughout the body with certain missions, right?
Yes, exactly. And so these are medical missions armed with information and the capacity to inject chemicals into the bloodstream and to make other kinds of, quote, adjustments. So imagine that you have these tiny little nanobots circulating around in the brain, and they're making changes in real time. This isn't just periodical, go in for a 6-month checkup to see whether we like what your brain is doing. This is all the time.
So
and that's the future that these technocrats are looking forward to.
Who's sitting behind the monitor programming the little robots in your brain to make changes in real time, right? Wow. So in other words, it's all headed toward the population becoming a mass puppet. Right? That's the way it sounds to me. Well, I mean, I got to tell you, in a way, to me, as far back as my history goes, or my study goes into history, I mean, I know human history is just a long and sordid tale of brutality and domination of people over other people, and that's just sort of that's part of the deal. But in particular in modern history, to me, a lot of this goes back to Freud and his nephew Edward Bernays, who when Freud came out with his discoveries about the unconscious mind and unconscious urges and aggression and libido, which is grossly misunderstood, that governments became terrified because it's redefined people as having these unconscious aggressive impulses, and that are capable of exploding and taking over and going out of control at any time. And since that time, governments have sought a way to pacify and make the population docile, and this is the continuation of that.
Absolutely. It's very logical within the context of what psychiatry and neurology have been doing since the beginning, and going back to the even earlier experiments of Pavlov and Wundt in conditioned reflex. So it's not surprising at all that we would see this brain mapping project emerge now, and people might consider it, sort of science fiction, but it really isn't. It's not at all science fiction.
Right.
If you look at the history of psychiatry, without going into a long song and dance here, you could simply see how far psychiatry itself has come down through history in terms of proliferating the number of fictional so-called mental disorders and all of the drugs and treatments for that. And so it's easy to see that the next step is, well, let's just map the whole brain and let's just control it. Let's not kid around any longer.
Yeah, let's take on the whole enchilada here and just take the brain over. We have the technology, right?
Exactly. Exactly what they're doing.
Well, it's scary stuff, and I mean, I understand that we're within 25 years of, being able to inject the little nano robots or what have you. And everything that I've read about it, which is not a lot, but people are excited about this stuff. It's like, you might not ever have to feel bad again. You might not ever have to be anxious or afraid or depressed or what have you. And to me, that would be horrible, because now what are you if you're not a human being anymore? If you don't have to struggle with the human condition, then you're not a human being anymore. The struggle is a good thing to figure that out. But people in general are looking forward to this stuff where it's like, okay, I never have to feel bad, as if that were possible, but it's largely touted as a very positive thing.
Exactly. They're doing this with a great messianic sense of joy and anticipation, and of course, they're overlooking what's available to us now in terms of the real history of the medical profession, in the sense that, we have good information that the current medical system in the United States is the third leading cause of death in America. Well, if you know that, then you know that a great deal of the information on which medicine as it's practiced now is based is completely fraudulent. So you're going to arm these tiny little nanobots with that kind of information as they circulate through your body, making changes, and be happy about the outcome of that? I mean, you'd have to be a complete lunatic.
Yeah, the third leading cause of death in America. These are the people that are going to map the brain.
Yeah, right.
Nuts. Listen, John, thanks for joining us on the show again, and as always, bringing this information from a totally different perspective that I think more people need to be thinking about and doing research. John Rappaport at nomorefakenews.com to find out more about John. And thanks for being on the show with us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
You're listening to Mental Health Exposed with Mike Bundren on National News Radio. This year alone, 1 in 3 Americans will experience a mental health issue. When coping with life's challenging situations of all kinds, it is important to get the right kind of help. Good therapy